Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IBAC SafetyNet webinar series presented today by Polaris Aero. We're going to be talking about flight risk assessment strategy, or check the box. I'm Catherine Hilst, and I am the IBAC operations manager and the voice behind the curtain for today. I just have a few items for you, a few housekeeping items. Because of the number of attendees, everyone is on mute, and you'll stay on mute during the presentation, but we welcome your questions. In your control panel, you will see a questions area, and aptly named. Go ahead and pop those questions in at any time, and we will take those once the presentation is over. Let's see, what else? Then, yeah, that's the main thing for the housekeeping items. So this particular session, Polaris Aero this is the second of three presentations that they're doing for us this quarter. And whether you use a traditional flight risk assessment tool or rely on pre-flight conversations to assess flight hazards, the panelists today will be discussing how it can be easy to miscalculate the value and importance of each hazard identified, not to mention that it's realistic to falter due to information overload. So what is your assessment really telling you, and what are you missing? Great focus. In this webinar, we're going to discuss the pitfalls of a traditional FRAT and offer a new paradigm for assessing flight risk information. And as a bonus, they'll be discussing how flight risk assessments are an integral part of an SMS that shouldn't be discounted. Steve Bruneau is here from Polaris Aero. He's the Vice President of Aviation Services at Polaris Aero and is responsible for expanding the company's suite of safety management solutions. He has over 25 years of process consulting experience helping organizations meet regulatory requirements with ISO 9000, change management, FRMS, and SMS, and achieve new levels of operational performance. Andrew Sedlacek is the safety manager and senior captain for HEB Flight Operations. It's a private regional grocery chain that operates 425 grocery stores in Texas and Mexico with 3 challengers. His passion in aviation is to help equip, encourage, and unlock the potential in others as they grow to understand the vital role in aviation safety. His flight department has been in continuous operation since 1958 and began its ISBAO journey in 2010. And they'll undergo their 4th Stage 3 audit next year, celebrating continuous improvement and a safety culture which exists because of the commitment of each and every team member within the department. And when he's not flying, Andrew cherishes every moment with his wife and attempts to, quote, stay young, keeping up with his 3 children, all while consuming vast amounts of coffee and ice cream. That's perfect. Okay. And Eric Francis is the manager of safety for a Part 91 operator based in Oklahoma City, operating a Global 5000 and a Global 6000. In addition to his flying duties, he's responsible for overseeing the department's SMS, FOCA analysis, and training programs. Prior to his employment in Oklahoma, Eric served as captain and check airman for Delta Private Jets based in Cincinnati, and he brings to his department 7 years of Part 135 experience in Learjets, citations, and challengers, as well as 10 years experience as a Part 141 senior flight instructor at Sporty's Academy in Batavia, Ohio. All right, with that, thank you everyone for being here. I'm excited for this one. And Steve, I'm going to hand this off to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Catherine, and appreciate Eric and Andrew joining me today on this important topic. Because oftentimes, as we come across different flight departments, the whole notion of doing pre-flight risk assessments isn't as consistent and complete as you'd like to think it would be for an organization to really remain as safe as possible and continue to improve over time. So today's presentation is going to follow this agenda. We're going to review what is the purpose of a risk control. Then we're going to get into the traditional way that these things are done. And then we're going to describe, where should this be done in the process, from the beginning of scheduling a flight all the way leading up to flight time. Then we're going to talk about the way in which these risk assessments really should be informed by the safety knowledge that's been captured within your flight department, right? You don't want to be just subject to the experience level of a singular pilot, for example. So we're going to talk about the way in which, as an organization, you're going to capture things in your safety program and be able to leverage that on future risk assessments. Then I want to have Eric and Andrew talk more specifically about some examples of the way they're doing some things, because obviously we want this to be near and dear to everyone's heart. So having those specific examples, I think, will help resonate the theory a little bit better. And then we want to talk about the way in which, if we can leverage technology better, how would that actually alter the scheduling process? So talk about the process as is at the top, and we'll come back and see how we can improve the process as we explore some solutions to improve. And then ultimately we'll close with some parting thoughts to kind of wrap up the key messages that you can hopefully take away from today's session, as well as share with people back in your flight department. So let's talk a little bit about what is the purpose of a risk control. So by definition, it's a means of addressing hazards before you do something. In the case of a flight crew, it's before you take off, right? What is this flight going to entail? What is it that we have to be aware of? And what are the things we're going to do to make sure that we get to the other end of this flight in the safest possible way? And there's a multitude of ways that this is done historically, and again, sometimes it's left to the discretion of the pilots, and others have more formal structural procedures and technologies within their flight department. So, but the point here is to address potential problems before you take off. When you look at a traditional FRAT process, what you typically see is a sort of a series, well, checklist, if you will, of specific hazards that the flight department wants to be reviewed before every flight. And the list you see here comes right out of the FAA guidelines, so it's nothing specifically unique here. But the FRAT has served the industry well for quite some time, right? It's a checklist, and checklists have their place. So I'm not suggesting that these are bad, but they have their shortcomings. And the thing to be aware of is what are those shortcomings, and are we accounting for those? And then more importantly, over time, is there a way to overcome those shortcomings? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the unique aspects here. So the first thing is that, let's say we applied this to a trip where after the pilot did the review, found two hazards in this list, the pop-up trip with a value of 3 and a twilight with a value of 2. Well, the traditional method, of course, is to look at this total list and add it up to a total trip score of, in this example, 5. And then the process holds that you take the total trip score and you overlay it on your organizational process. And if the total trip score stays below a magic number, we're going to consider that trip to be low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And if it goes above this magic number, then that will sort of engage chief pilot review or other management level oversight to get involved. So that's sort of the process that's typically performed. Now, the challenge here, there's several, but the first one is that it is subjective. So based on the seasoning of the pilot, the experience that they have flying in this airplane in this part of the world, and these conditions, what have you, their filling out of a FRAT might be different than another pilot on your roster. And the subjectiveness is something that organizationally you don't want to see, right? You'd like to think that organizationally you're very consistent across all your pilots, no matter who they are, and no matter how long they've been with you. When we experience turnover, you'd like to know that the new person is as complete as the person who just retired or left for other opportunities. So the subjectivity can sometimes get you in trouble. You need to be aware of that. The second problem is this one. Let's say a second trip is being analyzed, and the crew finds that there's only one hazard, it's severe icing. Well, do you think this is also low risk? The total trip score is a 5. The last trip, total trip score was a 5, and we said by our process that was in the green zone, so it was low risk. Well, the answer to this, of course, is no, right? No flight with severe icing possibility would be considered a low risk. And what this is demonstrating is that the math can sometimes get you into a trouble spot, right? And the real problem here is that there really is no fundamental unit when it comes to hazard scoring. So therein lies a challenge. And oftentimes what you see flight departments doing is spending a lot of time, overtime, always trying to jockey the numbers in a FRAT to try to make them be more influential when you do something. But no matter what you do there, you're kind of chasing your own tail because, again, there is no fundamental unit when it comes to hazard scoring. Now, when you do a risk assessment like this and you come up with your score, okay, now you have some assessment. But the second problem is that, okay, what are we going to do about it, right? So again, if left to the confines of a singular pilot, the what to do about it is also going to be constrained to whatever their experience level is. So that becomes a potential problem as well organizationally, because again, you'd like to know that all of your pilots would deal with a particular set of hazards in a very consistent way. So consistency is something that most safety programs really strive towards. You need to be mindful of how do you do that with the traditional FRAT approach. So let's look at the whole process that this is typically done. And it starts with either schedulers or pilots spending a fair amount of time researching a lot of information before the flight in order to fill out the FRAT. So let's take a look at all this information, right? Starts with, what's the weather going to look like? When was the last time they reviewed the aircraft flight manual? Check the NOTAMs. If you have a fatigue program in your organization, are they evaluating that? Looking at the flight schedule details, remembering what the ops manual says, being familiar with the airport runways they're about to go to, processing their flight plan, and then of course the general regulations and their own logbook status and so forth. So there's a lot of information there packed into the brains of the flight crew and the dispatch team. And that's just a lot of information, not only to first process, but then to retain and, more importantly, use on a daily and per flight basis, right? So let's take a look at that whole concept of the human memory, right? Can we really remember all this stuff and apply it at the right time consistently? So when you think about, again, all this information, and you're about to analyze a flight that you're going to have this morning, the key here is, will you know where to get the right information, or what information to bring back to your, frontal lobe, if you will, to apply it as you fly this, today's flight. Science has already shown and demonstrated time and again that if you don't use it, you lose it, right? If you read something or you're trained in something and you don't encounter that something for some period of time, your ability to remember how to cope with that is going to be compromised. That's just reality, right? We're all human. Our brains cannot retain everything forever. And many of you could probably have your own experiences with this where, it's a year after the fact and you encounter something and you're like, oh, wait, what did I learn a year ago? It's very difficult to bring up to the surface. And again, we want to be able to address this. So that's one of the challenges that you need to be mindful of with all of the information. As all of you on today's call know, the amount of information that you have already in your brain is a lot, and it's seemingly ever growing, right? Regs are changing, weather's changing, ops manuals are changing. Things are always changing, and you need to keep this information, right at your forefront all the time. So let's talk about the assessment process. Like when is the best time to assess risk, and by who, and when should this start, right? So let's take a look at the traditional process first. So typically when your passengers contact the flight department to arrange a flight, the scheduler is going to be able to check the dates and times, check the crew availability, check your airplane availability, and of course map out your city pair. And then typically that's where it stops. They book the flight. And then sometime in the future, whether it's tomorrow, next week, next month, 3 months from now, the pilots will pick up their roster. And typically that's when everyone starts to look at the risk assessment. So from the point that the customer calls for the schedule to the time you actually take off could be days, weeks, or months, in which case, as you evaluate it near flight time, if you discover that there's a problem, well, obviously now you run the risk of creating an 11th hour firefight. And of course, your passengers don't appreciate that. I'm sure your staff frustration doesn't appreciate that either. So what we want to try to do is figure out not just that it's done correctly, but where in the process can we do this so we avoid any conflicts and confusion and firefighting, most importantly. So what I want to do right now, before we get into proposed solutions, is I want to take a moment and again introduce Andrew and Eric to join us to talk a little bit about what their experience was with the traditional FRAT approach. So we'll start with Eric from HEB. Eric, if you would start describing some of the challenges you had.
First of all, thank you, Catherine and Steve, for having me on to talk about this. In our Part 91 department, our numbered system was usually the last part of the process. Up to this point, our schedulers, our dispatchers, looked at the trip in the fixed risk area. Where is it at? Is it mountainous terrain? Is it, what's the context of the trip? And by the time it got to the pilots had already been doing their variable risk assessments in their head, checking NOTAMs, checking the weather, seeing what logistics exists. So when it got time to get to the numbers, they felt forced to do it, and it had little buy-in. Also, as you said, you hand the risk assessment to 3 different people, you're variably going to get 3 different risk scores. But when it come down to it, going into Aspen on a snowy day in ski season, you can't say, can we lower the traffic? Can we move the mountains? Can we make it stop snowing? Can we just not go? How do you mitigate that risk? And which one climbs to the top as far as, its variable score? Which one gets more importance over the other one. So having those variables really came before the risk assessment was ever run, before you ever ran the numbers to see if you were to, ding the bell and get some help on this. You were already mitigating the risks ahead of time.
Excellent. And Andrew?
Yes, excellent. And to Eric's point, all that information, all that collective data, some factors we just simply cannot change. However, there are variables. Our past shows that we used a FRAT tool, which was a numerical value, just checking the box, literally. And as we're going down and making tick marks, we're getting equal numbers of equal value for very different circumstances. And so our past has been that while we collect these numbers, we're just looking for the green, the low risk, but it's not really involving the crew into what could be some very important conversations to have and saying, why are these variables present? What can we do about these variables? Is there anything that's within our realm of control? Or what mitigations can we take if this is what we have, and how can we make decisions going forward with that information?
Excellent. All right. So what I want to talk about now is some of the safety implications of this, right? Not just the information you've consumed through all those resources, but all of our flight departments are living, breathing systems, right? And they're continuing to evolve. Our missions continue to evolve, and our people change. So how can we take what we learn in our safety program and then become proactive with it? So here's a specific graphic to explain what I'm talking about. So when you have your safety program consuming safety reports and safety metrics, you're going to learn a lot about what's happening, and obviously those things that are safety related are going to be the things you want to really process, because those are the things you want to avoid in the future. So looking at an example, let's say you had a long landing in a near runway excursion, right? That's the what happened. The key to a safety program is being able to dissect that down to the why it happened. And when you do a root cause analysis, you want to evaluate all of the internal factors that could have been at play, as well as all the external factors that could have been at play. And when you do this sort of level of rigor in the investigation, what you're really looking to do is bubble out the true causal factors that led to the problem. So let's say in this example, we discovered that after investigating and talking to the crew and so forth, we found 5 problems. The crew had elevated fatigue. The crew had not been to that airport before. It was a procedural nonconformance. It was a nighttime landing, and it was a mountainous terrain airport. Well, when you look at this picture here with your safety hat on, what you see on the right is the Swiss cheese model, right? Those 5 holes lined up, and as a result of those 5 holes lining up, what happened on the left was the outcome. So the key here is to be able to learn from this and then be able to spot this kind of situation on future flights, so that should the situation be present on a future flight, you can appropriately warn the crews of, number 1, the hazard conditions, and number 2, what to do about it to avoid having the same outcome, or God forbid worse, right? So really that's the key, and that's the whole premise of being able to develop a risk control from your safety program. What have we learned, and then how do we apply it to inform future flights? So really that really is the holy grail of staying ahead of safety problems. So let's talk a little bit about the way in which this can be helped through technology. So what we want to be able to do is be able to take in information from your scheduling system or your flight planning system and evaluate that, and then have the technology automatically check the weather for you, check the NOTAMs for you, have programmed rules around your company ops manual, an airport database, and so forth. And as you can imagine, the technology can keep all of this information, much better than the human brain can, and it can also process it much quicker than the human brain can. But what the computer does that the human brain cannot do is be consistent, right? So not only can the computer aggregate all this information very quickly, it can process it in a very consistent fashion. But what's also important about a computer, as you know, is you can process it through a rules engine. So you have the ability to say, well, if this, and this exist, then we want to do this. Whereas if this, and that exists, then we want to do something else. So there's a power in this type of technology to be able to look for these hazards, put them together in certain combinations that then warrant an appropriate advisory to the crew. Now, using this example of what I showed a few moments back, you can see that if on future flights there's elevated fatigue, pilot hasn't been to an airport in, let's say, 12 months, it's a nighttime landing at a mountainous terrain airport, then we want to advise the crews about the fact that this situation has posed problems in the past. And we want to tell them, hey, be on high alert here, be vigilant about flying a stabilized approach and laying within the touchdown zone. So what you're doing is you're warning the crews ahead of time of problems that you've experienced and giving them the suggested things to be thinking about before they take off, not 5 seconds before they're about to land the airplane, right? So as they go into the flight with eyes wide open, the likelihood of having the same safety outcomes on the other end starts to become reduced. And that's the importance of what a risk control should be looking to strive for. So when you do this, of course, this is where you're taking your safety knowledge and becoming proactive with it. Too often a safety program acquires the knowledge and then it gets put in a book on a shelf somewhere. Maybe you circulate it digitally and say, hey, everyone read this ops manual. But again, it goes back to that memory problem I described earlier, where now you're relying on people to remember what chapter 7, page 4, paragraph 3 says when it comes to landing with fatigue at night and mountainous terrain airports, right? That's something you might not remember 12, 15 months from now.
It's as if you've recorded the Swiss cheese and go, here, this is what the first layer looks like. See these holes? This is what this condition is, and we've recorded that before, so here it is again.
Exactly. That's awesome. So what I want to do is I want to have Andrew and Eric kind of share some examples of the way they've applied this technology with that rules engine in 4 different areas, looking specifically at just a general safety kind of theme, any specific airport safety related things, specifics about their airplane, and then an example of a specific safety lesson learned that they then turned into a rule in the way I was explaining. So Andrew, I incorrectly started with Eric on the last one. I start with you on this one. So you start with the safety side and then Eric will do his safety side. So your first safety example, if you could explain that, that'd be great.
Excellent. Well, in any time, winter operations presents a whole new environment. And when you're a flight department that's based in Texas, you may say that your opportunity to be exposed to that winter environment could be limited. We do, however, encounter those types of operations. And so what's great about having a tool that can present that, as Eric says, that first layer of Swiss cheese, and here's the things that you're commonly faced with, is we can actually take something as simple as de-icing procedures for specific airports that we frequent, and we can grab that information to say, here's what to expect. We can give diagrams, maps, we can talk about the frequencies, the de-icing procedures. All this information can be gathered and presented to the crew even days before the trip, and it's not showing up at the airport saying, we need to be de-iced. How do we go about doing this? So we're talking about distractions, we're talking about time efficiency, and overall it is safety. So whether it's specific to those airports, we can pull that information. Steve also mentioned talking about you don't use it, you lose it. And that could be true for, again, for us in Texas. We may not encounter winter ops that often. So when we do, we can also use a tool that presents that first layer, and we can grab the pieces out of our manuals that talks about limitations, operations, cold weather operations, and de-icing, and we can present that information to the crew. It's great to know that you know where the information is in those manuals. It's even better if you can present to that crew, reference this chapter, this page. Suddenly now you're not looking, where is that? Where is that section? How do we go about that? I noticed cold weather, it's in this manual, it's in this manual, and now this tool is cutting out all that time saving and saying, here's your limitations, here's your procedures, and this presents itself in front of the crew, and time savings and safety tenfold.
Right, and it doesn't present if there aren't winter conditions. If the weather and the temperatures are summertime, you'll never see that rule. All right, Eric?
So what we found is with our international flights, as the COVID procedures continue to change for the requirements to get in somewhere to come back into the United States, it's been very easy to adapt our risk model to say, if you are on an international flight arriving in the US, it triggers that rule to say, you've got a 1-day COVID test requirement. And that comes up the moment you plan the trip. So as soon as Air Inc. Sends the flight plan to the risk assessment tool and says they're coming into the US, the crew knows it immediately, which can be a few days ahead of time. And it's not that they haven't been briefed, it's just like Andrew said, it brings it to the surface immediately and puts it right in front of them. Don't forget to do this.
Right.
So that's been very advantageous for us, is to keep up with current events.
Excellent. Airport specific rules, Andrew?
Yes, we do operate in Texas, but we also have, our operation has over 75 stores, grocery stores, down in the country of Mexico. It doesn't take long to research security hazards, things all over the world for that matter. When we hear about recent events, crews being affected in the countries of Colombia, you talk about crews that have been robbed at gunpoint on their way from the airport to the hotel in Costa Rica. I mean, the data is out there. So if we can grab pieces where we know we're operating to certain airports or we're going international, we can actually involve our security teams and grab another layer of basically risk mitigation that brings them into a communication process that says at specific locations, we can give tips, we can give security briefings, we can make sure that our crews are obtaining those briefings within a certain time frame before the flight commences. And then just the general information when you're going to an unfamiliar area internationally, where's a good place to spend the day? There may not be an FBO facility there. So what's a safe, reliable, reputable hotel? Where is there places to obtain food? All those concerns that you think could be distractions or things you've never thought about. Now, using these filters, when those populate, it gives you kind of a checklist to go down before the flight even starts.
Excellent. Eric?
So just as Andrew mentioned, going to remote places, and you want to be able to pass on those lessons learned from prior crews, whether that was a year or 2 years prior that a crew went there and they learned something very valuable that could be very advantageous to know. You're not going to pick it up through regular NOTAMs or weather or traditional sources, but we do a regular hunting trip to Hebronville, Texas, and on our first trip there, we realized that the chocks they have are only suitable for smaller aircraft. Flying a global in there, you want big chocks, and the ramp is slightly inclined. So we make a point to, every time you plan to Hebronville, Texas, a page pops up that says, bring your own chocks. There is no FBO there. It's a concrete shack. So when you're leaving the hotel in Laredo, bring the coffee ice papers with you. If the guy's not there, here's the gate code. All of this information, being able to give it to the crews, means that a guy that's been working here a week or 5 years all has the same information, and they all have that logistical advantage to say, aha, don't forget to do this. I was told that 6 months ago. Nope, I was told the moment I planned the flight, and that's been very helpful.
Excellent. How about some airplane specifics, Andrew?
Yes, Steve. And Eric brings up a good point. I'm going to pull in some data that just those conversations that Eric's been to a place and something that you would assume chocks are everywhere you go to. But being able to share that data presents the opportunity for us to say, hey, we visit a lot of small communities and we get requests from our passengers whom we serve to go to smaller airports. What we may assume is a given may not necessarily be. Do we need to take chocks? So we're all in this together, and as Eric is living an experience, that data being able to be shared, which is available, we use them as risk ratings, which highlights an airport. Hey, here's some food for thought before you go into an environment like this. Now we get to basically take that information from Eric and apply it to our own operation and say, look, because you have benefited the industry, now we get to gain that experience, we get to gain that safety measure, and now we're taking chocks with us at places that we just assumed was there. Airplane wise, yes. Oftentimes, I think as crews we're considered with, what's the minimum length of runway, or how much runway length do we need? Some other conversations that our team has discussed is not only length, but width. Is there a minimum? If we're serving grocery stores in smaller communities with smaller regional airports, when is narrow too narrow? And so we've used this to actually highlight any runway. So there's a filter. So it can even begin days ahead from our schedulers. So when a trip request comes in and we'd like to plan a flight and go visit this community, if the runway is too narrow, right away you get information. You have access to that this may not be the ideal location. We may need to go to just a little bit farther away and drive, because we have personal limitations as a company that we're only going to operate within a certain runway width or wider.
Excellent. And Eric.
Right. Well, and to add to what you're just saying, Andrew, you know, if let's say you're going to a skinny runway and it's a beautiful, calm, sunny day, that's way different than going there when there's a strong crosswind or a contaminated runway. So when you pair those triggers together, it may bring right to the forefront, like, this is a bad idea. Especially if you brought it right to the planner's face to say, I can tell the passenger right away that this might not be a good idea. Here's our alternate airport and plan B. So what we found with the airplane was that, you know, going into places like Aspen, we're trained for the special localizer procedure, which gives us lower minimums. However, there's a laundry list of notes to remember going in there. So when a crew plans to Aspen, note pops up with a link to our ops manual and our SOPs to review the procedures for doing that approach. And it brings it right in front of them. They can click the link, they go straight to the ops manual. And as you said earlier, Andrew, that, you know, all these things, you know, in your ops manual, it's a flood of information. You may not have used it for the past year, but suddenly it links to that page and you go, aha, I remember talking about that. I know I'm supposed to do it. And here it is, the opportunity to use it. So by having the trigger that says, don't forget to review the SOPs for this special approach. We even do it on visual days. Clear to visual approach, we are still doing that localizer approach for practice and walking through those SOPs so that one time a year that we absolutely need it, we've done it every time we've gone in there as a routine practice, and we've reviewed the SOP every time we've gone to that airport. That's been helpful.
Excellent. Let's talk about safety lesson learned. Andrew.
Yes, taking our past experiences, and as our crew members submit safety reports, whether they're events or even proactively and predictively putting concerns, could this possibly happen? We can gather that data and we can actually fold it into our risk assessments. We have an example where we had a crew going into David Wayne Hooks Airport. It is a part-time tower. So again, when the tower is operational, it's a different environment than when it's uncontrolled. Typically, we tend to arrive just prior to the tower opening. And so when we have a crew that's shooting just a normal approach and they break out, and suddenly you find that there is another aircraft, a business aircraft, that is backtaxing the runway for departure. And that's really the first thing that they see when they break out. No radio communications, nobody's talking, and they thankfully missed approach. But you take that data to say, at this time of day, when this tower is not operational, do we need to add layers? Do we need to consider? Do we need to delay the departure time so our arrival time is just after the tower opens so that we're getting some air traffic control variables to help mitigate risk? Absolutely, we do. Another example that happens to us very commonly, there's an airport in the Houston area, 8,000 feet long, 100 feet wide. For most of us, that's a fair amount of runway, and no questions, no problems. We find out though, if we're landing to the north, that threshold is displaced and we're gonna lose. We're down to about 6,000 feet. Yeah, that's a chunk. And if we have to shoot an approach, ILS approach, the distance beyond the glide slope, suddenly we find ourselves very close to 5,000. That's a completely different runway setting. Even if it's a 1,000-foot ceiling, shooting an ILS approach and realizing that distance got reduced drastically. If we add any moisture in there, what happens if that runway is wet? What's great is you can pull all those triggers and say, if this is favoring a north runway, if there's the possibility of shooting an approach, if there's the possibility of precipitation, and we can pull up historical data, not only with our own operation, but we would look and see that there was 2 corporate business jets that have had runway excursions, unfortunately, in those same conditions. So we've got to capture that data. We cannot let that fall by the wayside, and we've got to say, this has happened. We don't want it to happen to us. And so how can we pull these filters in that brings it right up to the forefront and gives those stops or those yields of a concern to the crew members?
Yeah, that's a great example. Eric?
In our example, bring up Aspen again. We used to run a couple 604s into there, and being the focal manager, I see a lot of the FDR data come through me, and I'm sorting it, trying to find trends. But when you get a one-off, such as a crew got in there, the ATC kept them high because they were going over the top of traffic, and in their efforts to get down and slow down, they inadvertently added the flaps above the limitation altitude. It's really not going to happen under normal conditions unless you're going into a mountainous airport like that. That limitation might even cross your mind. But there is no master caution. There's no master warning for it. There's no CAS message for it. The only thing that caught it was the FOQA. So it was a way to go, okay, here's a way of identifying the Swiss cheese that says, here's a big hole that nobody saw coming, that was identified after the fact, but I want to pass it along to those forward crews. So I go into the system, create a rule, create the trigger that says, if you're taking the 604 into Aspen, pop up a notification that says, be aware of the 15.5 limit on the flaps on the Challenger. And it was a very simple way to bring it to the forefront. We also did a department memo that just reminded people that, hey, this is a gotcha that could happen. And it makes the risk assessment serve as that master caution or master warning that says, this has happened. Let's pay closer attention in the future.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you guys sharing those examples and elaborating. Let's talk about the process a little bit. So again, typically the risk assessment is entirely the responsibility of the pilot right before flight time. And while we're not trying to alleviate the pilot of doing that, what we want to try to do is alleviate a lot of the burden for them doing this. So one of the things that we propose with using technology the right way is that assessing risk can happen right from the beginning of the process. If you have a scheduler who can facilitate, or if you just start your planning process sooner, but by the pilots, like in the case of Eric, as you'll hear in a minute. So when you go back to our process, when your passenger calls your flight department and your scheduler now checks the dates and crew and airplane availability and maps out your flight, one of the things we can do with technology integrated to your scheduling system is have your scheduler immediately run a flight risk assessment, which will then go check all that data that we were talking about earlier. And let's say, like the ones highlighted in red, there was a problem. Let's say that the NOTAMs indicated a critical runway that you need to land your airplane is closed for construction. Or let's say that you're going to be landing after sunset when your company ops manual says that's not what you want to be doing. So you have an ability right from the moment you take the phone call to be able to say, oh, well, can you leave 3 hours earlier so we get in before sunset and we're compliant with our ops manual? Or, hey, the airport you want to go to turns out they're closed at the time you want to land, so can we go to this alternate airport, or is that a problem? If you start addressing these things right up front, then what you're doing is you're giving your passengers an ability to be flexible on their side well ahead of time, right? It's not a firefight, it's days or weeks ahead of time, so they can accommodate much easier than typical potentially. But you're giving the ability to kind of get rid of a lot of things that now unburden the crews come flight time. So when you do this up front, again, now you pass it to your crews for tomorrow, next week, next month. Your crews pick up the situation here and they start looking at their upcoming flight, and all they need to do is basically rerun the technology and it'll do its thing once again. And let's say that now the NOTAMs have been modified, weather has changed as we know it does in our world. And let's say there's now a fatigue issue based on other flying that those crews have done that wasn't in the schedule originally. Well, at this point now the crews are very focused on what's left of the hazards being identified. They don't have to worry about, the twilight piece because that was done, by the scheduler up front. And maybe the NOTAMs opened up the airport, so maybe you can rewire the flight to go back to the original airport they had intended to. But the point is, you're now dealing only with the things that are left to be dealt with, and you're avoiding the 11th hour firefight, and you're also giving crews less workload because they don't have to mitigate stuff that could have been mitigated weeks ago. So that's important. And then of course, collaboration. I like to say that risk assessments pre-flight really should be a team sport. It really should not just be the pilots. And if we get people involved in an effective way, we're not creating work for people, we're making it more effective. And we really think that's a next generation type of approach to pre-flight risk assessments, which ultimately leads to flying as safely as possible. So what I want to have Andrew and Eric talk again about is some of having adopted the use of technology in this way versus what they used to be doing. Maybe share with you all kind of some of the improvements they've been exposed to. So correctly start this time with Andrew.
Yes. So the key is multiple groups and enhancing the engagement. And if I may, it may sound somewhat silly, but just practical and real. Here is a tool, right? It's a toothbrush. And I would say that we all check that box every day, right? But there has been technology improvements, and we call them now electric toothbrushes. And I'll admit, for myself, I was a little skeptical. And I had this dentist visit, and he's discussing with me the advantages. And although it sounds silly, an electrical toothbrush, we find that it's new technology, it's more efficient with the time, and it does most of the work for you. And so not only those factors, but I share that with you because of this, is that having purchased one, just as an example, and you bring that home, something happens. The family leans in, right? My kids, they're suddenly, where pun intended, it's like pulling teeth to get them to brush their teeth. Suddenly they think this is something new and fun. Suddenly they're engaged. Suddenly they captures their attention. Suddenly it's like a group huddle every day as we brush our teeth together. And really that's what this tool is. It's new technology. It's the efficiency of time. It's something that sparks people's interest. And once they dip their toe in it, suddenly they lean in. They're more excited. They are contributing information, and it just enhances the whole process. You take out those key pieces that are no longer a numerical value, but they're small discussions mitigating risk.
Excellent. And your post-flight, if you would touch on that, would be important too.
Absolutely. As we kind of mentioned earlier, we talked about what we call risk ratings, is a tool that is our post-flight briefings. The flight is over. It's usually how'd the flight go? Everything went well, fine. Are you okay? I'm okay. That has changed. Now we can say, if another crew would fly this same flight, is there any information that we would want to pass along to them? And certainly that does happen at certain airfields. I mean, Eric brought up a great point about Hebronville, Texas. We would want those crews to know they need to bring their chalks. We've had those with ramp congestion, with limited services. And so when we take that, we can put that into a risk rating. And not only are we now sharing that information about that location with our other crews, but also the whole industry benefits because other users using this platform now can pull up. Maybe it's their first time to that airport. Maybe they were unaware of how Sugar Land's runway starts shrinking more and more and more with certain criteria put together. So to pass that along, absolutely we should.
All right, excellent, thanks. And Eric, oh, you had one other thing there, yeah.
So I liked your example, Andrew, with the toothbrush, something that you might think is benign or that is routine. If crews aren't engaged, if people aren't engaged to think and be a part of what's going on as far as improving the way things go, it just becomes a check the box form. And nobody likes filling out the form. Sometimes they even space out why they're doing it, and they may skip one or the other. However, when you pull people together, and what we've done is I've encouraged people to file safety reports, not just for the near miss or the near accident or incident. That to me, that's not a safety report as much as it is contribute to how can we make our risk assessments and mitigations better, because the whole point of this is to mitigate the risks. Once we've identified them, it's now, okay, now what do we do about them? And if you're simply filling out a form to get a score and did you ding the bell or not, it doesn't really identify, okay, we're coming back from Europe, but this time we're doing it at night. We're leaving Italy at sunset, and we're going to be, tracking nighttime all the way to the States. So how about we create a trigger that says, if that setup is happening, why don't we make a risk control that says, for night fatigue reasons, once you're in cruise, every hour you need to get up for 2 minutes and walk around the galley, go to the bathroom, just stand up. Easy enough to do, provided that the workload is not intense, but it's that moment to wake you up. Or how about turning on all the cockpit lights in cruise? You don't, you're not taking off or landing, but those things will send the signals to your brain that I need to stay awake. And these are just some subtle things in that particular scenario that say, we've sat at the table, we've thought out some mitigation ideas, and please apply these to this particular flight because those parameters got triggered. By doing this, you start getting more contributions from the crews, and you get much more participation and buy-in to your SMS. It's more inclusive, and it's more valuable information than just getting a score. And you know, when as a focal manager, as I get information filtered to me, I'm the gatekeeper for the company. You know, if I see a trend starting to happen, I can create a memo. I can put out a read and acknowledge document. I can refer people to our manuals. I can bring those mitigation techniques to the surface. And having a system like this, it's like having the world's greatest dispatcher at your fingertips. You can program them with your custom reports, but they also know Part 91, Part 135, they know the limitations of the aircraft, they know the weather that's going on, and it's like you're going gold panning. So when you've got your pan full of materials, the overload of information that we have when it comes to pre-flight planning, it gives that good shift, and they can bring the gold nuggets to the surface, what you really want to know. And not just in the sense of safety of, you know, are we going to get hurt, but are we going to get violated? Are we going to inconvenience our passengers? What makes this particular scenario risky? And that's been extremely valuable.
Right, excellent. Thank you. So just to kind of wrap up, and then we'll open it up for questions, we wanted to kind of summarize sort of some parting thoughts to everything we just talked about here. So the first thing is that, you know, assessing hazards early and often is vital, right? If you give yourself more time before takeoff, you've got more options at your disposal. In the example that Eric mentioned about fatigue, right? If you're alerted to the fact you're going to have a fatiguing flight an hour before you take off, well, you only have so many things at your discretion to be able to do. But if Eric's and his crew were warned about the potential fatigue issue 3-4 days ahead of time, then all the crew would say, you know what, I'm going to make sure I store up my sleep bank and be well rested for that trip, and we'll make sure there's caffeine on board, and, you know, whatever the case may be. So the more time you give yourself, whether it's as an individual or as an organization, the more options you have. And then, of course, mitigating risk is why we're doing this. Working at it as a team adds a lot of value. You've heard, you know, examples from both Eric and Andrew where, you know, individual pilots know a lot, but as a team, they know a lot more. And the sum of the parts is obviously, you know, fantastic. And that's what you want to bring to bear. And dispatch, you know, they've got a lot of experience as well, right? Oftentimes a dispatcher has been in a flight operation an order of a magnitude longer than the pilots have. So to the extent all of this information is being shared, and again, not in a workload overburdening way, then you're again managing your safety knowledge as an organization. Again, I hope this came across in spades today. I think Andrew and Eric did a real good job of summarizing this. You know, that you just can't remember all this stuff. Not only can you not remember what you read or were trained in last week, but what you read or were trained in last week has probably changed this week. So you need to keep all of this information fresh, and that's hard to do as an individual person. So a tool like this just takes that burden off, not for everything. It's not intended to replace good thought and the fact that you have to read things, but it's to resurface these things when it's applicable. Automating these lessons learned is invaluable towards your safety program, which ultimately is important towards the longevity of your flight department, right? It's not just about solving the problem that happened yesterday. It's about making sure that yesterdays don't keep happening. And that's where you can really start to demonstrate that, you know, your safety program is in fact continually improving the overall safety of your flight department. So that's a key takeaway. And then last but not least, if risk controls are intended to keep you away from having problems, but if they're not used, they're useless. So whether it's technology like the one we're talking about here, you know, if you don't use it, obviously it's not going to help you. If you're doing frats and you don't do them correctly every time, they're not helping you. So you really need to look at this and really think strategically about what is the purpose of a risk control? Are we doing it? And then most importantly, are we doing it in a way that is producing the safest possible outcome? And if you take away nothing from today's talk except that one, that's probably the most important. Eric or Andrew, do you want to add anything to these?
You know, the numbers method had been valuable tool for a very long time. But I also often, now that I've had a chance to see this new technology, I think of it as version 1.0, trying to quantify the total risk of the flight and being able to identify specific areas where we've learned lessons from it before, and be able to put that right into a crew's face that maybe haven't seen it. Like you said, you can't memorize everything, and there's going to be points where people forget things. But if you have a system and a great tool that can sift through all the nonsense and all of the noise and bring to the surface the real important things, and either to flash an information, here, be aware of this, a master caution or a master warning that says, stop, you're about to violate something, or you're about to violate a rule, or you're about to go down a road, you're going through the holes in the Swiss cheese. What's your mitigation policy? We say, if you get a stop sign that says you're about to violate something, and most of the time for us, it's length of flight. It's, I've got a long flight from Europe coming back, and it's going to be 12 hours or 12 and a half hours. That goes beyond our normal flight time duty day. But my risk mitigation was, we got day rooms, we took a nap, we self-assessed prior to departure, and doing these things, I've mitigated that hard stop, that master warning that says you're about to go into dangerous territory. That has been the most risky part of that particular flight, and that was the one that was really addressed, not the fact that it was night or international or those things. You can't change those.
Exactly. Andrew, any other thoughts?
Completely agree. Time is a precious commodity, and I think that everything in today's world is the things that consume our time. So if we can be more efficient with that and add value to the time that we're investing, that is a huge win. And to have that tool do both of those things is great. You add the element of fatigue in there for a multiple aircraft operation. We use it from the scheduling a week out. We're already looking, do we swap crews here? We were unaware that this cumulative fatigue is growing as the week progresses. Corporate aviation, change happens all the time. Your times may change, and to rerun that and then to take a look, you can make scheduling changes there. Maybe you're a single aircraft operation. Just that awareness saying, do you realize how your week is stacking up? And possibly at this next destination, maybe this is the day where you do, as Eric says, you're not going to stay at the FBO. Go unplug, get a day room. It's time, because we're looking at your span. We're seeing everything cumulative, and bringing that awareness to say that we need to take some soft or hard mitigation techniques before the next flight happens.
Excellent. All right. With that, Catherine, we can open up the questions.
All right. Well, fantastic. I love I'm going to steal this is a team sport comment there. And I guess my takeaway is that this whole process sort of takes historical data and turns it into a living thing that your organization can engage with on a much more efficient and for lack of a better word, living way of doing it. So a couple of the questions that came up with this, so it sounds like you all have been doing this for a while. What was the transition like from using your traditional FRAT to this more sophisticated approach, dealing with the technology versus the old paper, or computer spreadsheet?
I can go for. We had a great response from it. Crews, and I say they didn't get much buy-in into the old system. As soon as they saw this way of doing it, they were like, wow, it rerun itself in the last 4 hours prior to departure, all automatically, because that's how we set it up. And it caught that I needed a destination alternate, which means I needed to pack on a little extra fuel, or it caught the fact that maybe a runway was closed, and I didn't notice it in the NOTAMs 2 days before, but suddenly 4 hours prior to departure, it popped up and said, oh, by the way. And they've really used it really well in that sense, in the fact that it's always looking over your shoulder at your flight plan.
Thanks, Eric.
And
Andrew?
I would agree. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, that transition period, I was blessed, surrounded by a great team, and there were others that actually championed this idea of bringing this piece on and taking some of those components, the AFM, all the information, and formulating some of those, that basically that foundation of rules, and then just demonstrating it. The greatest tool is just to say, even in a meeting sense of saying, let's run a sample flight and see what pieces of information it might pull for us. And then for us, it's kind of that, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more. So as I go out on flights, I can say, well, here's another little piece that we could do or add, or same thing with risk ratings as a post-flight opportunity. What is our standard post-flight briefing like? Hey, look at this piece. Not only does this share now with other crews, but it shares with everybody who's utilizing this tool, and everybody's benefiting and helping others. It's just that's a great feeling. It's the right thing to do. So it's a gradual, continuous improvement, and the enthusiasm and the engagement grows over time.
That sort of answers the next, comment. It's, avoiding over-reliance on your technology, or is this a tool to spark inquiry? It sounds like it's really a tool that keeps people engaged more than anything from that. When you talk about the rules, I have a couple of questions here, and I'll just throw two of them out because they're sort of related. One is there a lot of effort to produce rules? And then what happens as they change, or how are they monitored to make sure that they're still fresh or relevant or necessary? So two things: effort to produce them, and what about monitoring them over time?
Effort to produce. What if there was a database of rules that was already available that you could go and look and say, yes, that piece applies to me. This one applies to our operation. This one would be something that maybe we haven't considered before, but we now need to adapt that within our own operation. So number one, there's a resource available that allows you to grab that information. And number two, with the training that my personal experience that was provided, generating those rules was very user friendly. Just tabs and drop downs and saying, it's basically true false questions. If this exists, how would you like to proceed? We can communicate yields, stops. We can even make links to documents, reference certain manuals and stuff. So as far as that implementation, absolutely easy, wonderful experience.
Yeah, we had a similar experience with it. It already once you put in your airplane, it knows the limitations for the aircraft. It knows Part 91 already. So when all I really had to do was enter our flight operations manual, particular items. And as Andrew said, it's very lead you by the hand through the process. If this, and this, trigger this. And you can say, this is a master caution, this is a yield, or this is a master warning, here's a stop sign. You're about to violate a manual thing. So lots of built-in features, lots of built-in rules. It already knows a lot. Once you input, I think it's important. Your custom things, it's very easy to do.
Yeah, I think it's important to note too that you and Eric and Andrew can certainly elaborate on this. They didn't just sit down and spend 6 days, programming rules. They had the initial ones that they wanted to do to get started, but kind of as they talked about that cultural adoption, you kind of build out your rules over time, right? You know the sort of low-hanging fruit, so maybe you tackle those up front. But then as you learn things through safety and as you get more engagement, pilots and dispatch start seeing these rules pop up on a per trip basis, and you start to think, oh, there's an opportunity, we should add another rule, or hey, this rule, I think we need to change that because the conditions we last saw were a little bit different. So the fact that it's bringing this stuff up and it's dynamic and it's a living, breathing sort of resource, and you're checking it pre-flight as a team, then you kind of have a built-in quality check, and it doesn't have to be done all at once. Andrew, Eric,
it does become more seasoned with age, as we all do.
That's how we all feel, right? So this is related to that then as well in terms of how are the risks and mitigation strategies actually entered and managed in the tool?
When we create a risk control, it's up to, we have a short meeting of the people that were involved with it. What do you think we should be doing? And once we come up with an answer, you just simply type it in the box. So the system is just identify the trigger and kick out an answer. And the answer is whatever you choose to put in there, or the answer is something that it already knew prior to that. So if it's a Part 91 regulation, it knows the regulation. It knows that, hey, you're about to go past this boundary. If it's something lesson learned about an airport, it's whatever we choose to type in.
Oh, I think
I would
it's
agree.
Andrew
It's
pointed
that
out.
collaborative teamwork approach that it's motivated, self-motivating. You start putting in that foundational layer and you start adding, the regs, the limitations of the AFM, and you build upon that and you start sharing, hey, based on these lessons learned, what things do we want to present? What things do we want to see that they are part of that first layer of Swiss cheese, as Eric mentioned? And then what's exciting is you sit back and you start watching in the room other people saying, it would be nice to have, or I wonder if we should. And that is the culture. That is a thrilling moment, because now everybody's on board, everybody's participating, and that just culture, just you want to jump out of your chair. You really do. So that helps.
If I could elaborate on that too, I think when you start getting all of that kind of buy-in, that really drives at the heart of safety knowledge management at an organizational level. I'm sure we've all been at or seen a flight department where there's been a very important pilot who's retired. And when that person leaves the flight department, there's usually a giant sucking sound of knowledge that walks out with them. So if you are using the system like this and you're getting inputs from all of your pilots, the most junior to the most senior, again, you're locking in this knowledge so that when you do experience any kind of turnover, whether it's through people leaving or retirement, that knowledge carries forward with the department, not just with the individual pilot. So I think it's important to think of it at a safety knowledge management level as well.
Another term I'm going to steal from you. That's really, it goes back to that, making this historical data a living thing that stays with the organization. A question came in, is this only for US FAR regs, or are you able to add foreign non-US regulation?
Yeah, we already have some Canadian rule sets in there. We've got EASA rule sets in there. We're working towards an Australian rule set. So we can build additional rule sets. It's just as we work with our clients to facilitate, but we've got clients all over the world.
So it sounds like an operator can come in with their specific needs and plug into something that's already growing and living, yeah, and mature, and then add their specific needs into that.
Yeah, I think it's important because I think what you've heard in spades today from both Eric and Andrew is that this is a place that they self-manage their safety knowledge.
Yeah.
So, Polaris doesn't want to have clients coming to us to say, hey, can you build us a rule for XYZ? Right. I mean, we can do that in support of clients, but that's do you give a man a fish, or do you teach him how to fish? So we would rather teach our clients how to build these rules, because they're the ones with boots on the ground dealing with their missions and their aircraft and their personnel. So they know what their rules need to be, not just upon the initiation of a rule, but over time, is it still the right rule? Is it still an appropriate rule? So these are the things that we want to make sure our clients can do on their own. So teaching them how to build the rules is more important than just our ability to facilitate it.
Well, and to add to that, Steve, that as Andrew said, our Hebronville, Texas example, through the platform, I'm able to share that rule with the community to say, hey, everybody going to Hebronville, just know these things, and being able to share that through the platform has been very nice as well, because I feel like I'm contributing to someone else not making some mistake that we learned early.
Yeah, and I think the sharing thing is important. I think one of the things that our challenge is to make sure people contribute as much as they consume. Right. That way the database is again a give and take communal knowledge base. And by the way, if there's something in there that's no longer valid, like for example, Hebronville finally bought the right size chocks, and you have the ability to to vote down that kind of rule, and then eventually it'll go away because it's no longer applicable. So there's a way to make sure you can do that kind of thing as well.
That's fantastic. I think we're coming to the end. There is one question here about regulatory integration, including in the standard subscription, and I think I would punt that to emailing Steve at Polaris Aero for further questions like that. I know he would welcome any questions, comments. His contact information is on the slide, and there's another one, again, for Steve. Do you have a sandbox or LMS or tutorials a potential client can look at it to investigate? I'm thinking the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, we can certainly work with you.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right.
If anyone has any questions, just real quick, Catherine, before we close out, if anyone has any questions for Andrew and Eric, you can certainly email me and I'll pass them along and let Andrew and Eric get back to you directly as well. So I left their emails off so that they don't get bludgeoned, because this is more of a webinar kind of thing. But if you do have something for them, send it to me. I'll forward it to them, and they can communicate one-on-one with you guys. Perfect.
I so appreciate this idea of creativity, of making this an engaging enterprise, which is what it should be, right? It's we're in this every day, and there's a lot to think about, and the safety knowledge management, the team sport element of this really has been brought to bear in your discussions here today. I so appreciate you all being here. I'm members of the audience. Thank you. These are available in recorded format here, probably later today or tomorrow, so you can share these within your organizations or with your friends in the framework of sharing information. Polaris will be doing another webinar in May. I posted the link for registering for that. That's talking about resiliency and adapting to change. This has been a fantastic session. Thank you so much, Steve, Eric, and Andrew, for your time and your insights in this, and I'm sure that you will be getting some inquiries along the way. So with that, I would say fly safe, and we'll be in touch with all of you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next SafetyNet. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.